Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I am headed to the Smithsonian National Museum of American History to spend some time at their permanent exhibit called American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith. I have filmed the entire exhibit and all its artifacts as it walks us through how democracy in the United States came to be, how it has evolved over time, and how everyday ordinary people, not just politicians and presidents, have helped shape it. This exhibit covers everything from the earliest founding fathers to early elections to protest movements, fights for equality and voting rights to be extended to all, political campaigns, controversy, and much more. This video will be a full walkthrough of the exhibit as I have filmed it from start to finish, so if you've never been to see this museum before or never been able to view this exhibit, you might want to buckle up. There is a lot of information about each artifact on the walls and panels, so I have created voiceovers from that material to show you what we will be looking at. If you're a history buff like me, or may be curious about the evolution of American democracy, you may really enjoy this video. If those topics are not interesting to you, this might only serve you as a 2-hour adventure that will probably bore you to sleep. But let's get started. More than just waging a war of independence, American revolutionaries took a great leap of faith and established a new government based on the sovereignty of the people. It was truly a radical idea that entrusted the power of a nation not in a monarchy but in its citizens. Each generation since continues to question how to form a more perfect union around this radical idea. The world that British colonists inherited was ruled by kings, hereditary aristocrats, and wealthy gentlemen. Then, in the year 1776, Americans decided to change that world. They would do without a king or aristocrats. They would create a new government based solely on the people. But who would really count as the people, and how would it all work? Should wealthy and educated gentlemen still dominate the government? Could a new representative form of government truly represent the interests and views of common men and women? How should these people participate to make their voices heard? Ever since the revolutions, Americans have continued to debate these questions. Britons on both sides of the Atlantic believed that governing was the role of aristocrats and wealthy gentlemen. Political power came with economic power, with birth into the right social circles and with influential connections. Common people also had a limited role. Most common men who owned property could vote for a member of the lower house of their legislature. Voters could also serve on juries that enforced the law. Most did not qualify to participate in those ways, but free British subjects could petition their rulers with grievances in writing or with mass demonstrations or riots. They could seek justice in courts of common law with juries of their peers. Only wealthy gentlemen sat in the House of Commons, which represented the people of England. In the colonies, representatives elected to colonial legislatures were less wealthy, but most came from the upper ranks of their society. D. Ritchie, in A Treatise on the Hair in 1770, wrote, "Men should dress suitable to their various ranks in life, whether as a magistrate, statesman, warrior, man of pleasure, and for his hair, either natural or artificial, may be dressed to produce in us different ideas in the quality of the man." This teapot, engraved with the Robinson family crest, was made for Abigail Robinson of Newport, Rhode Island, around the year 1752. That year, Robinson married John Wanton, son of the governor of Rhode Island. Silversmith Samuel Casey may have consulted a guide to family crests such as John Guillem's standard book called A Display of Heraldry. This book explained, esquires and gentlemen all have ensigns of coats of arms, and thereby are distinguished from the meaner people. Parliament passed laws regulating trade within the empire, while routine taxes and legislation were left to the legislature of each colony. This painting is from 1793 called The House of Commons, the Lower House of Parliament. The act is from 1742 and was for better regulating the plantation trade meaning trade with all American colonies. Thomas Hutchinson, portrayed here as a young man, served as governor of Massachusetts from 1771 to 1774. Appointed by the king, royal governors pursued policies favored by the British ministry. They enjoyed power to appoint officials to execute the law, as seen in this appointment of a justice of the peace. Yet many governors saw colonial governments as dangerously out of balance, with no hereditary aristocracy to support executive authority and too much power concentrated in the hands of the elected assembly. Hutchinson worried that popular power, or the rule of the multitude, would bring anarchy and dictatorship to the colonies. George III became King of Great Britain and all its colonies in 1760. American colonists saw themselves as his loyal subjects. They celebrated his birthday, drank toasts to his health, and fought in his American wars. This plaster bust of King George III is from 1809. Men appointed as bishops of the established Church of England sat in the British House of Lords alongside the great aristocrats of the realm, joining the authority of church and state. This is a portrait of William Bateman, a bishop from Norwich from the early 18th century. This land grant, signed by Governor Thomas Penn in 1733, deeded a large farm in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania to Alexander McCamant. Landowners and successful artisans made up the middling sort in colonial societies. There were also the better sort and the poorer sort, but the colonies had a higher percentage of middling men than Britain did. Since owning property bestowed political rights, those men became accustomed to a voice in colonial politics. The engraving of William Penn is from the 19th century, and the map of Pennsylvania is from 1770. The House of Commons represented the people of England. By 1750, however, only about 17% of adult males in England were eligible to vote. In the colonies, more men owned enough property to qualify as voters than in England. An estimated 50 to 70% of adult free males in different colonies. Thanks to the availability of land, and more by circumstance than by planning, colonial politics allowed broader participation. This detail from The Election of Medley from 1764 shows qualified voters lined up to the right of the Philadelphia courthouse. In 1765, colonists said they were loyal to King George III and proud to be Britons. But what began as a disagreement over particular British policies quickly became a deeper dispute over government. Neither king nor parliament listened to colonial grievances. Many Americans believed that English authorities were influenced by wealthy private interests and personal ambitions. Even the British people seemed to think that colonists should have fewer rights than Britons at home. In 1776, many Americans made a great leap to a new idea. Maybe they could do without a monarchy and the aristocracy. If they could unite with one another, the people of the colonies might form their own, more equal society and government. Maybe the people were enough. This leather document box celebrated the repeal of the 1765 Stamp Act, a parliamentary tax on colonial newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, and even playing cards. Most Americans and many Britons in England welcomed the repeal as a way to heal divisions within the empire. Several similar boxes have survived, each with different initials but marked with the same phrase and date. This British image from 1774 criticized American patriots' practice of inflicting pain and humiliation on those who supported parliamentary authority. It shows the tar and feathering of appointed Customs Commissioner John Malcolm in Boston in 1774. Similar acts by crowds punished a relative few, but intimidated many more into compliance with patriot programs that resisted parliamentary laws. No property-owning requirements limited participation in street crowds. Widespread literacy made possible the effective circulation of ideas through published pamphlets, newspapers, and other print products. These publications circulated news and opinions to a growing number of subscribers and to patrons of taverns, which often provided papers for common reading. Even illiterate people could listen and debate current events when someone would read aloud to the group. Relief at the repeal of the Stamp Act evaporated when Parliament passed new duties on goods imported into the colonies. The new legislation also made law enforcement more independent of colonists' own ideas of what was just and fair. It appointed officials to enforce the law, provided them with broad authority to search private stores, and established courts without colonial juries to try disputed cases. Parliament rejected colonial claims that law enforcement, like lawmaking, needed to be accountable to colonial opinion. Events in Boston in 1770 confirmed many of the Patriots' worst fears about the dangers of putting policing powers into the hands of an armed military. British troops in Boston were supposed to see Parliament's laws peacefully enforced, but military occupation of the city created bitter disputes between soldiers and civilians. 5 colonists died when soldiers fired on a crowd. Silversmith Paul Revere, a fervent patriot activist, created prints of the event to fan the flames of public outrage. This copy is from Revere's plate and was made in 1832. Massachusetts officials used this pre-printed form to appoint William Sylvester as a Justice of the Peace in 1776. They crossed out the authority of King George III and replaced it with the authority of the Government and People of Massachusetts Bay. Thomas Paine's argument against monarchy and hereditary privilege and for American independence first appeared anonymously in Philadelphia in January 1776. It was so popular that 25 print editions appeared within a year. The colonists' grievances against British authority led them to organize together across the colonies. In turn, that organization gradually built a sense of connection to others who shared common ideas and demonstrated common commitments. As the dispute intensified, patriots slowly disconnected from British authorities and their own loyalist neighbors. In 1776, their experience of shared resistance led them to embrace a new political identity. This is Patrick Henry, delegate to the First Continental Congress in 1774. Colonial laws required free men of all classes to serve in local militias. In the long term, 8 years of Revolutionary War, Americans would depend on a professional Continental Army. In the short term, militia service helped defend the colonies and create a sense of common sacrifice. This powder horn was made and used by Minuteman Daniel Higbee from Massachusetts in 1775. The British musket, left in the colonies after the French and Indian War, was later used by Patriot forces. When colonial legislatures opposed British policies, many governors simply dissolved those assemblies. Unofficial groups, such as local committees, countywide conventions, and congresses, quickly became central to Patriot organizing. They relied on economic networks that include middling farmers, traders, artisans, working men, and free women to create a new political movement. The inclusive nature of the movement seemed to show that ordinary free people were capable of having a stronger voice in politics. This broken millstone came from the grist mill of Abner Beebe of East Haddam, Connecticut. When Beebe refused to take part in the Patriots' network of boycotts and associations, neighbors urged him to join in. When he spoke of his loyalty to England, Patriot committees banned all dealings with him. One crowd punished him with tar and feathers in 1774, and another broke his millstone in 1775. Sons of Liberty organized around existing social networks and organizations such as the firefighting companies. The movement relied on ideas and practices of common participation learned in such community groups. This leather bucket belonged to Samuel Allen Otis, a merchant and patriot from Barnstable, Massachusetts. The Latin motto on the bucket translates to "Friendship in Times of Distress." The East India Company was the wealthiest private corporation of the day. Parliament gave its stockholders a bailout by giving the company a monopoly on the colonial tea trade in 1773. They also kept a tax on the tea. Patriots in nearly every colony blocked the sale of the tea, either reshipping it back to England or forcibly storing it in locked warehouses. Boston was the first city to destroy East India Company tea in December of 1773. This creamer reminded tea drinkers not to indulge. Patriots created new economic networks by forming agreements not to use imported British commodities such as fine fabrics, furnishings, or tea. They hoped to influence British merchants and manufacturers and also to bridge social divisions among Americans. Free people of nearly any class could join and enforce an agreement. To join, the wealthy put aside imported styles to buy plainer products from their neighbors: linen spun by colonial women and woven by local weavers, gloves made by colonial glovers, tanners, and farmers, and herbal brews sold by country people to replace tea. This is a flax wheel from Rhode Island, 18th century. On this desk, Thomas Jefferson wrote the first draft of the Declaration of Independence in June 1776. Jefferson himself had designed this desk, including a hinged writing board and a locking drawer for papers, pens, and an inkwell. The desk was Jefferson's companion as a revolutionary patriot, American diplomat, and President of the United States. Late in his life, Jefferson attached a note to the bottom saying that the desk would likely become a treasured relic for its great association with the birth of the great charter of our independence. Congress voted for independence on July 2, 1776, then spent 2 days editing Thomas Jefferson's draft of the text. They officially declared independence on July 4th. In August, they signed a carefully lettered parchment copy that today is housed in the National Archives. Years later, worried that the original signed version was fading, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams commissioned engraver William Stone to create a copper plate to produce facsimiles of the text. Pictured here is a print from the 1823 plate. Adopting a new frame of government also required Americans to make a leap of faith. After a long war and many disputes, supporters of the U.S. Constitution declared the need for a stable, central government to secure the blessings of liberty to Americans. But the states had not always cooperated with one another, and Congress had been too weak to counter European and Native American powers or to settle conflicts within or between the states. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention agreed to shift power to the central government. At the same time, they provided the federal government officials to be elected, either directly or indirectly, so as to represent the people as a whole. George Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He used this small box to preserve papers produced by the convention. In September 1787, Americans had their first chance to see the new Constitution proposed by a convention in Philadelphia. Over the summer, the convention had met in private, allowing no press coverage of their debates or decisions. When newspapers published the plan throughout the states, debate over the proposed Constitution took place in pamphlets, papers, public gatherings, and private homes. Alexander Hamilton called this debate a great national discussion. In 1776, many colonists had made a leap of faith. They united around the ideals that all men are created equal and entitled to the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They declared that all government arose from the people and depended on popular consent. These ideals would shape American politics and society in the centuries that followed, yet it was an unequal world. Americans also inherited a belief in social hierarchy and institutions that perpetuated inequality. Through the generations, Americans inspired by the Declaration of Independence would contend with these conflicting ideas and commitments. Members of the convention that formed the U.S. Constitution generally shared a goal of shifting power to a central government and away from state legislatures. They also agreed that the new government should directly represent American voters, but they disagreed on many issues. The Constitution they created was the product of compromises between populous states and small ones, slaveholding states and free ones, states with claims to westward lands and states without. Equally important, the delegates had to compromise with the ideas of more common people in order to win ratification by the states and acceptance from the people. The Massachusetts Sentinel newspaper published a series of images showing each state that ratified the proposed Constitution as a pillar that, standing with the others, would create a new edifice. This image from January 1788 depicts the first 5 states to ratify in order from left to right. The adoption of the U.S. Constitution only began the discussion. Many people insisted on amendments. The first Congress passed the Bill of Rights in 1789. These 10 amendments protected institutions that many Americans considered essential to a free people, including a free press, free institutions of worship, armed militias, public assemblies, trial by jury, and freedom from unlawful searches and seizures. Creamware pitchers decorated with transfer prints, commercially made in England for American consumers in the 1790s and 1800s, celebrated the nation's commitment to civil and religious freedom and a system of state militias. This creamware plate from the 1830s records the First Amendment in honor of printer Elijah Lovejoy, who was killed by a mob in Illinois for publishing anti-slavery ideas. The ballot in this photograph names 4 men to serve as members of Maryland's delegation to the Electoral College in the first presidential election under the U.S. Constitution in 1789. The Constitution allowed state legislatures to choose their own preferred method of selecting members for the Electoral College that would in turn select the president. 5 state legislatures directly appointed members, while others established various systems that allowed voters to have a voice. In Maryland, the voters at large, nearly 8,000 men, voted for presidential electors in 1789. Every state's electors voted for George Washington to be president. Forced labor of Africans had long been an accepted part of European colonizing. The revolutionary ideals of equality and rights threw such received practices into doubt, and some people on both sides of the Atlantic organized to combat slavery and end the slave trade. The actions of enslaved Americans also had a deep impact. Many African Americans claimed liberty by enlisting in the British or Continental armies during the war, running away, petitioning or negotiating for their freedom, or rebelling. Their actions challenged the idea that enslavement was natural or acceptable to them. A growing community of free Africans demonstrated their capacities as citizens. Quakers, evangelical Christians, and Enlightenment thinkers criticized the slave trade and slaveholding. 24 men founded an anti-slavery society in Philadelphia in 1775. The group grew and adopted this Constitution in 1787. They worried that the U.S. Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause already endangered free people of color. Newspapers free from government control seemed essential for citizens to be well informed about public affairs. But newspapers changed dramatically in the 1790s when America became deeply divided over both foreign and domestic issues. Colonial papers had declared themselves to be above party politics. Now, many newspapers became frankly partisan, presenting only one side of every issue, denouncing anyone who disagreed, and sometimes printing rumors about the personal lives of the political opposition. Benjamin Franklin identified this printing press as the one that he had used while learning his trade in England in the 1720s. The press became a historical icon through its association with the famous revolutionary. Franklin symbolized the powerful influence of patriot printers in spreading enlightened ideas and mobilizing American colonists towards revolution. Yet his grandson, Benjamin Franklin Bache, faced indictment for printing criticisms of the John Adams administration in the 1790s. Active in both the American and French revolutions, many women saw themselves capable of a vital political role. During the 1790s, women attended speeches and parades, took sides in partisan disputes, and sometimes published opinions in the press. In New Jersey, women with property could even vote. Revolutionary ideals of universal rights led to challenges against women's subordinate status within a marriage. Women persisted in seeking access to education as a route towards richer lives and fuller participation as citizens of their society. They founded schools throughout the country, but especially in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, to teach girls many of the same disciplines taught to boys. The new government assumed much the same position as European empires in the Americas. It viewed Indian nations as potential allies and buffers against Spanish, French, and British powers on the continent, but it also presumed the right to displace native peoples when possible. America's reliance on extensive land use for economic growth and social stability created powerful pressure on the native peoples who populated most of North America. The U.S. government also continued the European practice of giving silver medals to influential native leaders. Often worn as ornaments, these medals helped cement alliances in the unstable world of native, European, and U.S. territorial claims. These medals depict Presidents George Washington and James Monroe and display two hands clasped together on the back. This cane belonged to Toussaint Louverture, a military and political leader in the Haitian Revolution. The revolution began as a slave revolt in the French colony of Saint-Domingue in 1791 and ended with the emancipation and the founding of the Free Nation of Haiti in 1804. Nearly 500,000 enslaved people gained their freedom. These events terrified U.S. slaveholders and other whites while they heartened African Americans. The United States did not recognize the independence of Haiti from France until around 1862. A U.S. Department of State official acquired this cane later in the 19th century. The American Revolution had a powerful impact on people and events outside the borders of the newly created United States. International events of the 1790s and 1800s also inspired and challenged Americans to think about the commitments and meanings of their own nation, including the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, the Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804, the founding of Sierra Leone in 1792 by African American loyalists, the Irish Rebellion in 1798, Gabriel's Slave Revolt in Richmond, Virginia in 1800, the Confederacy of Tecumseh from 1808 to 1813, the German Coast Slave Revolt in Louisiana in 1811, and the War for Venezuelan Independence from 1811 to 1821. This much-used Bible belonged to Delaware farmer Stokely Sturgis, who converted to the growing Methodist movement through the influence of an enslaved man named Richard Allen. Moved by Methodism's indictment of slaveholding, Sturgis agreed to sell Allen his freedom. Allen became a preacher and moved to Philadelphia. He founded the Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church there in 1794. The disruptions of wartime, the initiatives of enslaved people, gradual emancipation in northern states, and voluntary manumissions in the South all contributed to the growth of free Black communities. Freed people moved to urban centers for economic opportunity and to build their own supportive communities. By 1800, they had created African churches and mutual aid societies in Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and Boston. The revolutionary generation opposed organized political parties that promoted the interests of only one part of the people. True patriots, they believed, should put aside self-interest and narrow views to promote the good of the whole society. But Federalists and Republicans found themselves bitterly divided in the 1790s, when working men, small and middling farmers, slaveholders, and petty dealers formed Democratic Republican societies. Federalists attacked them as dangerously radical. President George Washington denounced them as unrepresentative groups. Newly elected President Thomas Jefferson sought to heal the bitter feelings resulting from divisions of the past decade in his inaugural address of 1801. This picture quoted his effort to bring the two parties together. "We are all Federalists, all Republicans." A lampoon of one Democratic-Republican society illustrates the era's partisan hostility. It showed some recognizable figures and types of the day: Jefferson orating, David Rittenhouse looking through a telescope, an African American addressed as Citizen Mungo, and the devil enjoying the scene, unknown artist, 1793. Because the Constitution gives states the job of running elections, ways of voting in the United States vary. Americans have developed a patchwork of manual, mechanical, and electronic balloting. Many methods, once common in the past, are still used in some places today. The earliest elections were conducted by voice vote or with paper ballots put into ballot boxes. These paper ballots, called party tickets, listed names from just one party, and they were counted under the watchful eye of local party and election officials. As the United States grew and the electorate expanded in the decades following the Civil War, improvements appeared in the form of the Australian or blanket ballots that listed the names of all candidates, ballot boxes with mechanical security features, and mechanical ballot counters. The term ballot is derived from the Italian word ballotta, meaning little ball. This ballot box was not used in a U.S. election, but was used by members of a Washington, D.C. social club. Voting in the 19th century usually involved casting a printed paper ballot. State election laws typically specified the dimensions and thickness of the paper and the size of type to be used. The rest was left up to the issuing parties, local party operatives, and candidates, resulting in various ballot forms and styles and a potential for voter confusion and fraud. This paper ballot is from 1836. More so than the distinguishing marks of party symbols or candidate portraits, color helped observers identify party ballots as they were cast and who cast them. Voting was still not entirely secret. The parties printed and distributed paper ballots cut from sheets. Virginia's Union Party issued a pink paper ticket in 1860. The introduction of a complex color scheme distinguished the official ballot of the 1878 regular Republican ticket in Massachusetts. The glass ballot jar became a symbol of democratic self-government. This glass ballot jar from 1884 is typical of the transparent devices used to secure paper ballots. These crayons were made to be tied to the writing surface of a booth where voters could mark their ballots in private. Developed in South Australia in the 1850s, the blanket ballot, listing all candidates for office regardless of party, was gradually adopted into the United States after 1888. The printing and distribution of such all-inclusive ballots became a function of government rather than the competing parties. The voter typically marked the ballot in the privacy of a voting booth, sometimes guided by party symbols like the eagle guarding a glass jar ballot box representing the Republican ticket of William McKinley and Garrett A. Hobart. Political manipulation and election fraud was often compared to a well-oiled machine. Reformers determined to fight the political machines with ballot reform and voting machines. The addition of an internal cylinder roller to this late 19th century ballot box ensured that once a ballot was rolled into the box, it could not be tampered with or seen. This box was probably used in New England. The Constitution made the presidency and the positions of senator and representative elective offices. By the early 19th century, rivalries among political factions in the new government led to the creation of a competitive party system. The promotion of candidates among an expanding electorate placed increasing importance on the success of popular political campaigns. The earliest objects in this display commemorate George Washington's inauguration as the first president in 1789. Washington was the nation's overwhelming choice, and the popular artifacts associated with his presidency generally celebrated the man and the office. With the realization of an in and out party system in the era of Andrew Jackson, advocacy replaced commemoration. Commemorative clothing buttons, sewing boxes, and crockery gave way to expendable campaign advertising novelties such as badges, buttons, and ribbons. These objects are the products of an economy of popular promotion that sought to instill a high level of activism and engagement. Pictures made for American buyers celebrated notions of liberty associated with both the American and French republics in the 1790s. Decades later, this fire hat from the Citizen Fire Company, founded in 1836 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, continued the Revolutionary era's fondness for the figure of liberty. Yet liberty became less popular in prints, lithographs, and other parts of the 19th century. The staff and liberty cap she carried and the broken chains she had once stood above became controversial and uncomfortable symbols of an end to slavery, an institution that many Americans were coming to defend and promote as necessary and good. Made in England for the American market, these ceramic wares reflected many Americans' regard for George Washington. After Washington's death in 1799, images of the great man ascending into glory or in apotheosis became popular. Ralph Wood's factory in Staffordshire produced this relatively affordable bust of Washington primarily for the American market. To broaden their political community, Americans worked to make formal education, once the province of elite families only, available to a wider population. Growing numbers of states and localities supported schools as vital institutions for creating the informed citizenry that the nation required. Students wrote lessons and worked problems on school slates rather than on expensive paper in classrooms throughout the country. Without kings and hereditary aristocrats, there still seemed to remain two different sorts of free people in the United States: the wealthy elite and the untutored ordinary people. Free working people were essential to political and military actors in the Revolution. Many, accordingly, sought a greater voice in political life. Skilled craftsmen formed general societies for charitable and educational purposes, as seen in this certificate of New York's General Society, founded in 1785. By 1800, journeyman mechanics, who worked for masters for a wage, began organizing combinations to negotiate to improve their working lives. In decades later, as they gained the right to vote, tradesmen would form working men's parties to promote their interests, views, and candidates in elections. The powers and policies of banks quickly became a divisive issue in the United States. Bank advocates noted that banks would support economic growth. Bank critics complained that they channeled capital largely to merchants and manufacturers rather than to farmers or small producers. Some objected that privileges of incorporation given to banks generated large profits for private investors. Officers from the Continental Army formed the Society of Cincinnati in 1783, intended as a patriotic society to promote fellowship among the officers and their French counterparts in the war. But excluding enlisted men and limiting membership by heredity struck some Americans as dangerously aristocratic. This porcelain plate depicts the goddess Minerva, or Fame, holding the society's eagle insignia. It belonged to George Washington, the first president of the society. Members wore the insignia on badges, as seen in this portrait of Theodosius Fowler, an original member. The most enduring images in American political life are those drawn from the natural world. Rivers and springs reflect the ever-changing courses of politics. Monsters suggest the carefully apportioned boundaries of congressional districts, and animals have come to represent the major political parties. This gerrymander cartoon first appeared in the Boston Gazette in March of 1812 and was quickly reprinted in the Federalist newspapers in Salem and Boston. The cartoon expressed opposition to state election districts newly redrawn by Massachusetts' Jeffersonian Democratic-Republican Party led by Governor Elbridge Gerry. Fearing that the Federalist Party would gain power in the 1812 election, Gerry consolidated Federalist voting strength in a salamander-shaped voting district. The practice, though not invented by Gerry, became known as gerrymandering. Party symbols drawn from the natural world helped to dramatize political issues to reach 19th century Americans, including those who could not read. The donkey, as a Democratic symbol, dates back to the late 1820s when Whig attacks against Andrew Jackson rendered his name as A. Jack Ass. Medals illustrated with donkeys and pigs bore slogans criticizing Jackson for removing federal deposits from the Bank of the United States. Harper's Weekly featured Thomas Nast's Democratic donkey for the first time in 1870. Nast had often used the symbol to represent ignorance. Nast featured an elephant for the first time in 1874 to represent the Republican vote. He rendered the animal, unsure of its own weight, plodding through planks representing its own party platform. Nast's elephant and donkey appeared together in a cartoon for the first time in 1879. Born in Germany, Thomas Nast immigrated to New York in 1846. Nast's gifts for illustration and social observation found ready use in national mass circulation news magazines that did not yet have the means to publish photographs. He published more than 3,000 drawings, primarily in Harper's Weekly between 1862 and 1885. Nast favored union-affirming policies and enjoyed the relative autonomy to express his political views. His early cartoons skewered the corrupt regime of New York City's William Marcy Boss Tweed. Nast went on to popularize the elephant and donkey as symbols of the Republican and Democratic parties. Nast may have painted this self-portrait around 1884 when he lost his fortune in a Wall Street Ponzi scheme. It is perhaps a self-caricature. He renders himself with a furrowed brow collapsed into a chair. An open drape reveals New York's Trinity Church at the foot of Wall Street. Out of favor with his editor, Nast left Harper's Weekly in 1887. He later joined the Democratic National Committee as a contract cartoonist, but never recovered a national audience or financial position. Thomas Nast continued the tradition of using animals as symbols in party politics and sharpened it as an art form. In this satirical cartoon, Nast depicts New York City's corrupt Tammany society as a fierce tiger being whitewashed by Democratic presidential candidate Horace Greeley, 1872. Democratic and Republican Party leaders would never have chosen the animals that Thomas Nast did to popularize their policies and ideas. The parties typically adopted national symbols such as the eagle and the flag. After 1840, the Democratic Party often represented itself as a rooster. Such symbols contended, however, unsuccessfully with the popularity of donkeys and elephants into the 20th century. This ambitious chart presents U.S. political history on a single page. Moving from left to right, a timeline of parties, policies, persons, and events courses like a river through graphic space marked in 4-year intervals. The analogy between politics and springs and rivulets that jump and rejoin their banks is the most conspicuous feature in the timeline. The parties appear in different colors. The ascendance of a party is gauged as its stream rises above the center line and above the streams of the other parties. The thickness of a stream indicates the party's strength. The diagram is meant to dramatize U.S. political history in a more accessible shape for educators and to offer a ready reference for scholars, those who study statistics, and statesmen, 1880. Informal institutions and activities not actually spelled out in the Constitution help make America's participatory political system possible. State and national parties, nomination and ratification conventions, and intense and elaborate campaigns are examples of the informal processes Americans have adopted that give life and form to the ideas in the Constitution. This is a log cabin parade prop from 1840. It is a model log cabin that was hoisted on a pole and carried in parades by supporters of William Henry Harrison during the 1940 presidential campaign. The Whig campaign of 1840 against incumbent President Martin Van Buren established a pattern of predetermined imagery from which later campaigns have seldom deviated. The Whigs adopted the symbols of the log cabin and hard cider to promote the candidacy of General William Henry Harrison. An outpouring of everyday ceramics with designs of log cabins and canes with miniature hard cider barrels for heads soon followed. Whig glassware, spoons, covered dishes, and children's tea sets all declared for log cabins. The expansion of white male suffrage in the 1830s led to an expansive strategy of political imagery that co-opted hatchets, axes, and log cabins as empathetic symbols that could be understood by anyone. The exclusive use of such symbols masked the difficult and contentious positions of rival candidates and partisans who, with a wink and a nod, universally embraced the rough-hewn values of the American frontier. Use of the axe as a political symbol dates to the era of Congressman Davy Crockett. Like his fellow Whigs, Crockett recognized the political value of assuming a self-effacing personality. His partisans played along. The Young Men's White Association of Philadelphia, for example, presented Crockett with this ceremonial silver, mahogany, and ivory-tipped hatchet in 1835. One side of its head is engraved Crockett, the other side is engraved with his motto, "Go Ahead." The closely contested election of 1860 generated mass entertainments such as wide-awake torchlight parades staged on behalf of Republican presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln. Banners, badges, and ribbons proclaimed allegiance to the Constitution and the Union. By her own account, temperance reformer Carrie A. Nation used rocks, a sledgehammer borrowed from a blacksmith, and a barroom billiard ball to destroy 5 Kansas saloons before she took up a hatchet to destroy a Wichita, Kansas saloon on December 27, 1900. Saloons were illegal under Kansas state law but tolerated by officials. Explaining her choice of weapon, Nation recalled that the state's liquor interests had nothing to fear from the usual temperance advocates, but they were not prepared for a furious woman with a hatchet. Her saloon smashings became known as hatchetations, a play on words coined by the publicity-savvy Nation herself. A Topeka, Kansas druggist supplied Nation with little pewter hatchets to sell to cover her legal fines and travel expenses. Nation found that the public clamored for her hatchet souvenirs and readily grasped the meaning of them. Though distancing themselves from Carrie A. Nation and her hatchetations, the Women's Christian Temperance Union and other organizations could hardly ignore the hatchet as a symbol of teetotaling activism and popular engagement. Somewhat at odds with this message, the hatchet's head is decorated with the emblem of a box turtle, an icon of dryly unexcitable endurance. A critical remark made by a Democratic newspaperman gave birth to the log cabin and the hard cider barrel as Whig symbols to promote the candidacy of William Henry Harrison. The newspaperman wrote that Harrison's rivals could easily, quote, get rid of the old general with a barrel of hard cider and settle a pension of $2,000 a year on him, and my word for it, he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin by the side of a sea-coal fire and study moral philosophy, end quote. Though the Democratic press reprinted the suggestion as a cutting remark, Harrison's Whig friends embraced the everyday attributes of log cabins and hard cider. This fence rail piece is one of many made for the Friends of Abraham Lincoln. This piece from 1830 is attributed to Lincoln's cousin and rail-splitting partner, John Hanks. Dennis F. Hanks, another cousin, sold it at the Northwest Soldiers' Home Fair in Chicago in May of 1865, a little more than a month after Lincoln's assassination. Dennis Hanks wrote the label for each fence rail for his illiterate cousins John Hanks, who added his X as an affidavit. John Hanks was one of two men who had carried fence rails into the Illinois State Republican Convention that made Lincoln its presidential candidate in 1860. The imagery reversed Lincoln's public persona from the attorney he had become to the rail-mauling day laborer he had been. The rise of printing and engraving led to the production of ribbons for political campaigns and commemorative events. Simple and straightforward, graphic appeal of the ribbon neatly fit the politics of personal association reflected by all manner of knickknacks, household items, and specialty merchandise imprinted with a symbol or emblem. Some partisans were content to just wear a ribbon. Quilter Abigail Ann Lane and her husband, William Bagley Lane, a Philadelphia engraver, acquired enough Whig and William Henry Harrison ribbons to sleep in. The quilt is composed of 3 different ribbon designs. The most prevalent ribbon commemorates Harrison's inauguration as president in March 1841 and his death about a month later, a date printed near the bottom of the ribbon that was not part of the original engraving. The quilt is made of 432 ribbons stitched together and backed with plain white linen. According to family tradition, the Lanes acquired, or were left with, enough overstock ribbons for Mrs. Lane to assemble this quilt. This facsimile gear and lever voting machine was last used in the 1944 presidential election between Franklin D. Roosevelt and Thomas E. Dewey. Small models like this acquainted voters with the workings of the actual machine. The row and column ballot of parties and candidates was based upon the graphic design of the blanket or Australian ballots that these machines began to displace after the turn of the 20th century. From 1900 through the early 1960s, the gear and lever voting machine was promoted as an ideal technology. Television promised to extend the participatory premise of American democratic institutions to every home. Political specialists believed that verbatim telecasts of conventions, rallies, and speeches would allow a new home-based audience to experience the spectacle of a presidential campaign. By the 1960s, specialists capitalized on television techniques that emphasized performance and stagecraft, including the candidate debate or joint candidate appearance and the spot advertisement. Those campaigns joined today's political performances and advertisements in a cloud of competing images and crosstalk on the internet. The inventors of modern vote recording systems try to make the technology tamper-proof and user-friendly, although not always successfully. The recount of ballots in Florida during the 2000 presidential election created debate about the reliability of punch card ballots and precipitated a national crisis of public confidence in voting systems in general. Most previous national elections had large enough margins of victory to mask the shortcomings of vote recording systems. But a close presidential election race, ballot templates that allowed for off-center punches of computer card CHAD, and a confusing butterfly ballot design in one Florida county tested public confidence in the nation's vote recording machinery. The close presidential contest between Al Gore and George Bush came down to a struggle over the vote in Florida. In Florida, Bush led Gore by 930 votes out of 6 million votes cast. Gore asked for a recount by hand of ballots from 4 counties in which he believed his support was strong. To conduct the recount in Palm Beach County, citizens organized into teams of 2 Republican and 2 Democratic Party counters and observers. A magenta-colored card is used to help identify the holes in the ballots. Incompletely punched ballots that could not be counted by machine were considered voter errors. Judge Robert Rosenberg used this magnifying glass to examine ballots in an effort to determine voter intent during the hand recount in Broward County, Florida. The Constitution made the presidency and the positions of senator and representative elective offices. By the mid-20th century, badges, buttons, and ribbons began to be replaced by investments in radio and television advertising and opinion polling. Gearing up for the 2004 New Hampshire primary, campaign volunteers for Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry made this sign for the Manchester, New Hampshire headquarters. The sign's arrow gives the distances in miles to 8 New Hampshire cities this campaign would regularly visit, as well as the distance to the White House. Kerry's sign was modeled after the swamp sign seen in the MASH television series set during the Korean War, and it evoked signs posted by American forces in Vietnam, where Kerry had seen combat. Kerry won the Democratic primary in New Hampshire and went on to become the party's presidential nominee, but he lost the general election to incumbent President Bush. At times, money, scandals, and politics just seem to go together. While many people hope dishonesty is the exception, the more cynical believe it is just the norm. This drawing is from Norman Puck, 1889. Newspaper cartoonist Clifford Berryman lampooned presidential candidate William Taft for using the issue of tariff reform to fill his wallet in this 1908 drawing. This cover says it all in the Exposé of the Capitol's Underside, 1951. In one of the most publicized political scandals in modern times, lobbyist Jack Abramoff pleaded guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and tax evasion. The case, which centered on an Indian casino, uncovered a world of bribes, money laundering, and double dealing that even surprised the Capitol's establishment, 2006. The face of Jay Gould, financier and railroad developer, is formed by the limbs and branches at the center of this poisonous tree blooming with bribes. Like other forms of petitioning, lobbying involves direct actions intended to influence governmental policy. From the days in which politicians were regularly confronted in Washington, D.C. hotel lobbies, it has been a significant way that some people have affected and participated in their government. Lobbying has been carried out by individuals and informal groups advocating their causes and by well-funded professionals who represent large corporations and established organizations with significant sums of money at their disposal. And where money and power meet, there is always the possibility that in this representative democracy, not everyone is listened to equally. This is a sampling of materials left behind in congressional offices in 2014. In the 1890s, it was said that you would know that spring had arrived in Washington when Susan B. Anthony in her red shawl was seen at the Capitol advocating for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony used this inkstand while she was the editor of The Revolution, a weekly publication of the National Women's Suffrage Association in the late 1860s. The portrait of her is from around 1890. The role of professional lobbyists has always been controversial. Congressman Alfred N. Phillips in 1937 posted a sign on his office door welcoming everyone except professional lobbyists. In this 1949 Milton Bradley board game, players assume the roles of senators and representatives navigating their bills through Congress with the help and hindrance of special interests. From local protests to massive marches in Washington, demonstrators have forced officials to confront issues that they have often wished to avoid. By any imaginable means, people have come before the government and demanded to be heard. Carrying signs, singing songs, and shouting from a podium, whether beautiful and moving or disrespectful and offensive, these demonstrations are an exercise in the American democratic process. These are piles of signs ready to be picked up by marchers for the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. One of the first nationally organized petitioning drives was a protest against the federal government removing Cherokee Indians from their eastern native homelands. Since then, petition drives have focused on topics as diverse as can be imagined. Here are just a few examples. The simple act of adding your name along with others to an official appeal asserts your political identity and rights. While petitioning has been open for everyone, it was especially important for those who were barred from voting. In the early republic, mass petitioning provided poor white men, women, free blacks, and other minorities a means to voice grievances and to claim a role in determining the direction of the country. Petitioning has maintained a role in the democratic process. Whether they are traditional paper forms or electronic mailings, petitions continue to offer a means for individuals to shape political discourse. In the 1830s, abolitionist groups, often organized by women, conducted massive petitioning drives calling for an end to slavery. Southern delegations and their Northern supporters feared that any attention heightened regional tensions and promoted slave rebellions. On May 26, 1836, the House of Representatives adopted a gag rule stating that all petitions regarding slavery would be tabled without being read, referred, or printed. Former President John Quincy Adams, who had returned to Congress, took up the petitioners' cause. Slowly, support for the Adams campaign grew, and on December 3, 1844, the House abolished the rule. The vote was a major defeat to the supporters of slavery, who recognized that their powers to maintain federal support was at risk. This photograph is of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in 1851. Julius Pruitt and Company presented John Quincy Adams with this ivory cane made from a single elephant tusk in recognition of his leadership against the gag rule. The cane was decorated with a gold inlaid eagle holding a petition. On the band below the knob is inscribed in Latin, "A man just and firm of purpose." When the rule was defeated in 1844, the date was added to the eagle's wings. The enactment of the gag rule, rather than discouraging petitioners, energized the anti-slavery movement to flood the Capitol with written demands. Activists held up the suppression of debate as an example of the slaveholding South's infringement on the rights of all Americans. These are petitions sent to Congress in the 1830s. Following independence, citizens of the new nation sought to forge their own identity and create a unique history. They established holidays such as the 4th of July and later Thanksgiving Day, and chronicled the story of America from the landing at Plymouth Rock through the Founding Fathers and the Revolutionary War. In part, Americans did so not only for themselves, but also to instill in future generations a shared ideal of citizenship. The First Amendment of the Constitution established that Congress shall make no law restricting the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Not limiting their participation to electoral politics, individuals and groups with very different resources on the streets, in backrooms, and through the media of their times have brought their interests and concerns before the nation. Through early 18th century petitioning and mass demonstrations, formal and informal lobbying of government officials, and electronic letter writing campaigns, Americans have exercised this very basic democratic right to shape their country beyond the ballot box. The historic images that hung in classrooms across America were intended to instill patriotic values and reinforce the idea of a shared national heritage. While George Washington was a perennial favorite, fellow President Abraham Lincoln tended to be only regionally displayed. This print of Lincoln is from the Nannie Helen Burroughs School, established for African American women and girls in Washington, D.C. Francis Bellamy wrote the original Pledge of Allegiance. It was first published in The Youth's Companion to coincide with the dedication of the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago on October 21, 1892, as a way to instill American nationalism through flag ceremonies. The pledge was quickly adopted across the country. This ribbon is from the opening ceremony of the exposition. Creating celebrations helped to establish national identity. The 4th of July, widely observed during the American Revolution, was the first national holiday. It quickly became a day of patriotic symbolism and a tribute to the founding principles of equality and liberty and revolutionary ideals of democracy. For Americans still fighting for those freedoms, the holiday became a day to remind the country of the promise yet to be fulfilled. This holiday banner is from the 1860s. Mason Locke Weems's biography of George Washington became the most widely read 19th century book about the Revolutionary War and its celebrated hero. Weems recounted many familiar anecdotes about Washington, including the famous story of the cherry tree, and helped to establish a national narrative that cemented founding fathers in our national consciousness. Washington's stature as father of our country is borne out by the dozens of pageants and plays that celebrated the bicentennial of his birth and continue today. By the mid-19th century, Uncle Sam became the most recognizable personification of the U.S. government. Rather than an authority figure, he was most often portrayed with affection and used as an emblem of national kinship to instill patriotism. Wilbert E. Leppian wore this costume and handed out these printed cards. Leppian first appeared as Uncle Sam in 1956 and took part in numerous ceremonies and parades across the country, including 5 presidential inaugurations. A curious and short-lived phenomenon of the late 19th century was the creation of monumental clocks. The Clock of America was made by C. Chase of Boston, about whom little is known. Elaborate in design and featuring an array of mechanical devices, this spectacular clock was made to animate American history. Bridging the distinctions of entertainment and education, the exuberant folk motifs include the arrival of Columbus, a procession of U.S. presidents from George Washington through Benjamin Harrison, and other patriotic images. Like many monumental clocks, it features astronomical symbols, the zodiac, the phases of the moon, and 7 deities of ancient mythology representing the 7 days of the week. Since the 1990s, there have been many attempts to establish national standards for teaching American history. These efforts have sparked contentious debates over how much schools should focus on teaching patriotic values and the history of the nation through the Founding Fathers and aspirational figures, or teaching historical understanding and the stories of less famous and diverse people and groups. Schools throughout the nation have struggled to find the right balance appropriate for their communities. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968, transformed the civil rights leader into an icon of the struggle to fulfill the American promise of equality for all. This panel is from the 1968 Poor People's Campaign, a demonstration in Washington, D.C., which King helped to organize but did not live to see. On April 8, 1968, 4 days after he was assassinated, Congressman John Conyers introduced a bill to establish a federal holiday in his honor. For advocates of the legislation, it was an effort to place Dr. King and the civil rights movement into the national narrative. It took years of organizing to overcome strong resistance. In 1983, the King Holiday Bill was signed into law. Initially, only 27 states officially acknowledged the holiday. Not until the year 2000 did all 50 states recognize the day. In a nation created by immigrants, nothing has been more debated than what should be the ideal character of its citizenry. One view is that multiculturalism, the preservation of diverse cultural heritage, enriches the country. Some have called for a common citizenry, a melting pot where immigrants are assimilated and their traditions are transformed into a homogeneous American culture. Still others have challenged diversity by seeking to restrict immigration and exclude certain racial and ethnic groups. These very different positions have greatly impacted the nation's political debates on economic, foreign, and immigration policy, and education and social welfare programs as well. Zayvon Saradian, an immigrant from Armenia, created this banner in 1976 to celebrate the bicentennial. According to Saradian, the Armenian letter for A symbolizes the beginning and the letter B expresses continuity. The Armenian cross is a symbol of Christianity brought from the Old World to the New. The two American eagles are for strength and victory, and the flag represents independence and liberty from tyrannical oppression. Many immigrants sought to preserve their cultural heritage while at the same time embracing their new identity as Americans. Manfred Anson did so in designing this Hanukkah lamp to mark the centennial of the Statue of Liberty in 1986. Anson, who escaped Nazi Germany as a teenager, later reunited with family who had immigrated to the United States. For this lamp, Anson combined a traditional Polish menorah and figurines cast from a 19th century Statue of Liberty souvenir. Reflected in the long history of American politics is a recognition and sometimes a celebration of the diversity of the nation's electorate. A delegation of Plains Indians gave these beaded moccasins to President Ulysses S. Grant during an 1870s peace conference in Washington, D.C. The design united motifs and forms from both cultures as a powerful statement of hopeful coexistence. This photo is a school pageant with the teacher dressed as the Statue of Liberty, surrounded by students from the Lower East Side of New York wearing traditional costumes around 1910. The Ford Motor Company dramatized the ideals of Americanization in its elaborate English school graduation pageants. Workers in foreign dress entered into a giant pot stirred by the school's teachers and emerged in their best American clothes waving the United States flags around 1916. From 1880 to 1920, over 20 million people, largely from Eastern and Southern Europe, came to the United States. In response, the government and industries developed Americanization programs to turn the foreign-born into patriotic citizens by teaching real American values and English. This poster, issued by the private National Americanization Committee and distributed by the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Education, represents the ideals of the Americanization movement through the use of the flag and its symbolic message expressed in verse. Although the ideal of Americanization was to welcome all foreigners, some groups were viewed as too disruptive for the rest of the pot. In this example, Irish radicals were seen as too unruly to mix in. The American Party, also called the Know-Nothings, was a major national political force in the 1850s. It saw immigrants and Catholics as the greatest threat to self-government and to the nation. Arguing for rule by native-born Protestants, the Know-Nothings ran former President Millard Fillmore as their presidential candidate in the 1856 election. Though James Buchanan won the presidency, Fillmore received over 21% of the vote. During the Civil War, the movement fractured and largely disappeared, but fear and distrust of new immigrants remained within the core beliefs of many future political movements. This 1970s bumper sticker was directed at anti-Vietnam War protesters and the counterculture they represented, but the calls for exclusion of certain groups span the history of the nation. Americans desiring a more homogeneous citizenry did not limit their restrictions to certain ethnic and racial groups, but also sought to exclude those of differing political, social, and economic philosophies, religious beliefs, or sexual orientations. In the 19th century, agitation against Asian Americans spread across the country and led to some of the nation's most restrictive immigration laws. The founding generation of American political leaders asserted that the independent nation would be based on the ideal that its citizens had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the government under the Constitution was designed to promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. With these rights, they believed, came responsibilities that citizens needed to assume in order to fulfill the promise of the new nation. These lofty goals and principles never had a singular interpretation and over time have led to differing ideas and heated debates. The U.S. Constitution requires that the federal government take a census every 10 years. Citizens are required by law to be counted and to participate in this fundamental aspect of the democratic process. The primary purpose of the census is to allocate seats in the House of Representatives to the states according to their population. The scope and brutality of the Civil War quickly challenged the military resources of the North and the South. The Confederacy and the Union established general compulsory military service. Many considered the draft an infringement on their individual liberty. Critics charged class discrimination as the North and South drafted laws that provided financial ways to avoid service. The debate over military draft has continued ever since. Today, all men are required to register for selective service at 18 years of age. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1913, granted Congress the power to impose a federal income tax on individuals. The concept of contributing your fair share is widely held, but agreeing on what that is all depends on who is passing the bill. In a nation based on the sovereignty of the people, the jury system is one of the cornerstones of American democracy. Established under the Constitution is the right to an impartial jury of one's peers. This right also implies an obligation of citizens to serve as members of a jury. One of the many core responsibilities of citizenship, the most basic, has been being a good citizen. The founding generation believed that liberty and freedom could only survive if the Republic and its people were virtuous. For them, and still today, This means respecting the country's institutions, fulfilling civic duties, contributing to the community, and generally being a good neighbor. This public service poster is from 1971. San Francisco poet, artist, and publisher Lawrence Ferlinghetti was an influential figure of the 1950s Beat generation and the social revolution of the 1960s. In 1956, he was arrested and tried on obscenity charges for publishing and selling Allen Ginsberg's poem Howl. This landmark case established a key legal precedent for the publication of controversial literary pieces. His victory expanded the right to free speech and opened the way for an explosion of new works that tested the boundaries of literary expression. This is his typewriter. The most basic right of citizenship has been equal access and protection under the law. The fight to extend this right to all began before the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal and continues to this day. One of the assumed rights of citizenship is that your government will represent you. Originally serving as a letter of introduction to foreign governments on behalf of Americans traveling abroad, the very earliest passport was designed by Benjamin Franklin during the War of Independence when he served as minister to France. While regulations have changed over the years, passports are official documents issued by the U.S. Department of State that identify the holder as a citizen. The Second Amendment of the Constitution granted that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. In response to economic crisis, at times the government has enacted massive employment programs. One such program, the Works Progress Administration, employed as many as 8 million people during the Depression of the 1930s. Federal legislation enacted in 1964 led to the establishment of the Office of Economic Opportunity as part of the War on Poverty. Though not guaranteed by the Constitution, Americans have largely agreed that an educated citizenry is a requirement for a healthy democracy. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled that public schools segregated by race were unconstitutional, stating, "In the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place." Through their decision, the court entered into the ongoing debate of whether education should be a right of every citizen. Citizens have turned to the government to advance public health, whether combating yellow fever epidemics in the 1790s or funding cancer research in the 21st century. In the 2000s, the long-debated subject of national health care became a hotly contested political issue. The central question was, should all citizens have the right to medical care, and if so, how should it be made available? "13-year-old Goodwin Palmer documented the election of 1860 with a collection of 4 ferrotype medallettes picturing that year's presidential candidates, each attached by thread to a piece of cardstock. Abraham Lincoln won a plurality of the popular vote in the 4-way race, followed by Stephen A. Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, and John Bell. With the success of the Lincoln Wide Awakes in 1860, manufacturers of torches and oil-resistant parade clothing redoubled their efforts to supply ready-made paraphernalia across the political spectrum. Tintype, picturing Lincoln wide-awake archer wearing oilcloth cape and cap holding a pole and torch, 1860. New York City's Unexcelled Fireworks was one of several companies that developed a robust trade in oilcloth parade clothing, hats, and torches made for political clubs and their marching units throughout the northeastern United States in the late 19th century. Even though children and adolescents could not vote, They participated in the presidential campaign by attending the public events that their parents and other adults did, often wearing clothing and hats made especially for them. Political campaigns of the 19th century reflected popular traditions of commemoration and celebration, such as 4th of July parades, that became familiar to many Americans in the early republic. The mechanisms of popular politics not specifically called for in the Constitution, parties, nominating conventions, and electoral campaigns, drew freely on the evocative image of such festivities in promoting candidates and building the momentum of the campaign. Mass campaign spectacles arose as a way of demonstrating partisan strength and of mobilizing indifferent and easily distracted voters. The successful presidential campaign of Republican Abraham Lincoln perfected the nighttime torchlight parade as an entertainment of unprecedented scale that attracted the attention of men, women, and children. The concept originated in Hartford, Connecticut in 1858 and was revived for Lincoln's campaign by the city's young Republicans. Tailored, oil-resistant, enameled cloth capes distinguished the marchers, some of whom were too young to vote. Their example spread from Hartford to cities in the northeastern United States, which contributed traveling companies totaling some 10,000 uniformed men with torches to a grand procession in New York City on October 3, 1860. The martial spectacle, including fireworks, Lincoln's wide-awake transparencies, and floats, created envy among the city's Democrats and panic among Southern sympathizers who regarded the torch-lit parade as a provocation. The colorful pin-back buttons that we think of today appeared for the first time in the campaign of 1896. Coated with celluloid, a new plastic material, the pin-back button was a stylish departure from the metal clothing buttons that celebrated George Washington's first inauguration, the metal tokens that lampooned Andrew Jackson's attack on the Bank of the United States, and even the stick pins that acquainted voters with the likeness of Abraham Lincoln. The celluloid button, made with a patented process that sealed a paper disc under a shiny layer of clear plastic on a metal shell, presented colorful graphic possibilities. The celluloid button became a collectible in its own right on the way to commercial success as a wildly popular advertising medium. Whitehead and Hoag sold to consumers through jobbers throughout the United States, who solicited orders for custom-made ribbon badges from lodges, societies, conventions, parades, and political organizations. Each ribbon came packaged with a piece of cardstock in a reusable envelope. Whitehead and Hoag published testimonials of its timely service, including praise from the Badge Committee for the inauguration of President Grover Cleveland, which ordered over $1,600 in badges like this one for the ceremony. The celluloid process held up well into the 20th century, but it was undercut by the relatively inexpensive process of metal lithography developed by rival firms such as the Green Duck Company, which created this sample card around 1956. The process of printing a metal lithograph button started with the stamping dies seen here. Each die is displayed next to an example of its finished button ready to wear. Well into the late 1950s, political parties, candidates, and campaign managers believed in the pin-back button and other novelties as vital and vibrant advertising media. Given away for free to be displayed as emblems of political activism and engagement, such novelties stimulated partisanship, sustained constituencies, and won elections. New York City's W.R. Schofield distributed unexcelled fireworks, flags, lanterns, balloons, torches, and caps to jobbers who sold campaign supplies directly to streetwise political groups and organizations. The Whitehead and Hoag Company of Newark, New Jersey, acquired the rights to produce celluloid pinbacks after purchasing a series of patents in the 1890s. The firm produced buttons under the trade name of Whitehead and Hoag until it was sold in 1953. As new and diverse groups of Americans won the right to vote, local and national concerns shifted from whether or not they could vote to whether or not they should vote. Some advocates and officials encouraged voters to come out to the polls and looked for ways to make voting easier. Others changed voter registration requirements and election day rules in attempts to minimize the political power of newly enfranchised groups. Whether it is about voter qualifications, ballot language, or physical access to the polls, Americans continue to debate whose votes and voices should be counted in our representative democracy to this day. Bostonians protested the Supreme Court's 2010 decision in Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission. The court ruled that the First Amendment protected the rights of corporations, associations, and labor unions to pay for advertisements supporting or opposing political candidates. This and subsequent rulings have spurred heated debate over the role and amount of private and corporate contributions in election campaigns. Concerns over whether or not votes are being accurately recorded are not new. The results of the 1876 presidential election between Samuel Tilden and Rutherford Hayes were close enough to require recounts of ballots in Louisiana. President Ulysses S. Grant sent this telegram requesting observers to monitor the recount to prevent the election being stolen by the Democrats. The election was eventually settled in Republican candidate Rutherford Hayes' favor by a special commission of congressmen and Supreme Court justices. Tickets and tally sheets allowed spectators to follow the deliberations of the Electoral Commission. After the 2000 presidential election, many states proposed or adopted new voter requirements. Some aimed to ease voter registration, extend voting times, and ensure absentee voting. Others created more stringent requirements for voter identification and residency, and cut back on early voting. Supporters claimed that the new regulations would help eliminate voter fraud. Opponents countered that there is little evidence of widespread voter fraud and that these laws disenfranchise poor and minority voters. Activists have brought public attention to the needs of voters with physical, cognitive, and emotional disabilities. Their efforts have resulted in legislation to make polling places and ballots accessible to all Americans and recommendations to end centuries of disenfranchisement. Legislators in each state create its election laws and requirements for voting, which are administered through state and local election boards. The federal government may challenge state laws that it believes violate citizens' constitutionally protected voting rights under the 14th and 15th Amendments and federal voting laws passed by Congress. Congress can only pass laws regarding federal elections, but unless the states want to administer two different sets of voting regulations, the laws that they pass affect state and local elections as well. States issue absentee ballots so voters who will be away from home during an election can cast their ballot by mail. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 requires states to display a voter's Bill of Rights in all polling places. California posted copies in English, Spanish, Chinese, Hindi, Japanese, and many other languages. The Civil War became the first conflict in which arrangements were made for deployed soldiers to vote. Who the Union soldiers would support, Abraham Lincoln or their former commander George McClellan, was critical in determining the outcome of the 1864 presidential election. During World War II, federal ballots were provided for service members who had not received their own state's absentee ballots. Proponents of tests to prove an applicant's ability to read and understand English claimed that the exams ensured an educated and informed electorate. In practice, they were used to disqualify immigrants and the poor who had less education. In the South, they were used to prevent African Americans from registering to vote. The Voting Rights Act ended the use of literacy tests in the South in 1965 and the rest of the country in 1970. In Mississippi, applicants were required to transcribe and interpret a section of the state constitution and write an essay on the responsibilities of citizenship. Registration officials selected the questions and interpreted the answers, effectively choosing which applicants to pass and which to fail. During the summer of 1964, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee sent volunteers into Mississippi's African American communities. They registered voters and taught civics, voting rights, and reading to children and adults. Begun in the 1890s as a legal way to keep African Americans from voting in southern states, poll taxes were essentially a voting fee. Eligible voters were required to pay their poll tax before they could cast a ballot. A grandfather clause excused some poor whites from payments if they had an ancestor who voted before the Civil War, but there were no exemptions for African Americans. This is a 1935 poll tax receipt from Arkansas and an anti-poll tax button from the 1940s. In 1964, the 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes for federal elections. 5 states enforced payment of poll taxes for state elections until 1966, when the U.S. Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. Before the Civil War, the majority of states barred men convicted of serious crimes from voting. By 1920, only 3 states had no form of felony disenfranchisement. Depending on the state, applicable crimes included murder, voter fraud, burglary, vagrancy, or any other crime resulting in imprisonment. In theory, disenfranchisement guaranteed a moral voter pool. In practice, it legally reduced the voting populations of minorities and immigrants. Today, millions of otherwise eligible voters, many of them minorities, cannot vote because of felony convictions. After the Civil War, former Confederate officers were stripped of their political rights, including the rights to vote and to hold office, and required them to take oaths of loyalty to the United States to regain them. In 1868, the 14th Amendment made loyalty to the United States a requirement for voting when it specified only 2 reasons for disenfranchising a citizen: participation in rebellion or other unspecified crime. This presidential pardon was granted to John Walden in 1865. Earnest pleas, lighthearted jokes, and the occasional touch of guilt all play a part in encouraging Americans to vote. Behind the seemingly innocuous reminders is a serious concern. More Americans than ever before are eligible to vote, but many do not go to the polls. Some who do question whether their vote really even matters. Get Out the Vote campaigns declare that a vote not cast can never be counted. They remind citizens of their responsibility to exercise the often hard-won right to vote and encourage all who can to be enthusiastic participants in the communal experience of voting. Advocates for a wide variety of constituencies and causes work to build a sense of community among like-minded voters and encourage them to turn out on Election Day. High voter participation can make a group a force to be reckoned with and can pressure politicians to pay attention to their causes. By the time the U.S. Constitution was written, states had established their own qualifications for voting and office holding. Rather than attempt to force a compromise among the differing standards, the framers of the Constitution left the states to determine who among their residents was eligible to vote. This created a country of citizens with unequal representation, rights, and responsibilities. 4 times, Congress has approved and states have ratified constitutional amendments addressing this imbalance and giving voting rights to specific groups of Americans throughout the United States. In this background mural, Alice Paul, leader of the National Women's Party, unfurls a banner stitched with a star for each state that ratified the 19th Amendment. The 26th Amendment was ratified in 100 days, the fastest approval of any constitutional amendment. In an attempt to be the first state to ratify, Delaware's legislature voted on the amendment an hour after it was approved by Congress. "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," was the rallying cry for lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. A first attempt during World War II, when the draft age was lowered to 18, was unsuccessful. But during the war in Vietnam, the issue gained momentum again, led by young people themselves. In 1970, congressional supporters changed the voting age in an amendment to the extension of the Voting Rights Act. When the Supreme Court ruled that it applied only to federal elections, a constitutional amendment became the inevitable next step as states confronted the alternative of administering 2 sets of rules for state and federal elections. The 26th Amendment, establishing 18 as the legal voting age, was ratified in 1971. The U.S. Constitution did not grant the District of Columbia representation in Congress or the Electoral College because it is not a state, and placed its governance in the hands of Congress. Since the 19th century, residents of the city have petitioned for voting rights. In 1961, the 23rd Amendment gave residents of Washington a vote in presidential elections, but a 1978 attempt to ratify a constitutional amendment by giving them voting representation in Congress failed. Although it is the nation's capital, the issue of D.C. voting rights has remained a mostly local issue. Washington, D.C. residents voted for the first time in the 1964 presidential election. Lyndon Johnson received the capital's 3 electoral votes. Since 1973, D.C. has been governed by an elected mayor and city council, but residents still cannot elect voting members of the House of Representatives or Senate. 5 years after the 13th Amendment ended slavery, former abolitionists who believed in equality for freedmen and practical politicians who saw their votes as a way to retain Republican control of the conquered Confederate states worked together to ratify the 15th Amendment, giving African Americans the right to vote. African Americans celebrated the ratification of the 15th Amendment as another step toward equality, but the celebration was short-lived. Within 10 years, former Confederates had regained control of Southern state governments and began to use intimidation, violence, and restrictive voter qualifications to keep African Americans away from the polls. Tradition says that early suffragists used this delivery wagon at speaking engagements and to distribute the suffrage magazine Women's Journal. Later suffragists painted the wagon with slogans and continued to use it for rallies and publicity, as well as magazine sales. The women's suffrage movement was first introduced in 1878 and languished for decades in a Congress that felt no need for women's votes. 40 years later, suffragists had won full or partial voting rights in 18 states and were sending sympathetic legislators to the Capitol. Their work for the World War I effort, combined with persistent lobbying and demonstrations, finally won President Woodrow Wilson's endorsement. After a year's delay, congressmen, mainly Republicans, worked quickly to pass the Woman Suffrage Amendment, hoping it would be ratified in time for new voters to show their gratitude in the 1920 election. Pennsylvania Governor William Cameron Sproul used a pen in the woman suffrage movement's signature yellow hue to sign his state's ratification of the 19th Amendment. Three generations of women fought to overcome objections and convince the male voters who would decide the issue that women had the right to vote. Opponents claimed that women's suffrage would lead to neglected children, masculine women, confused gender roles, and prohibition. Suffragists and supporters countered with images of strong but feminine voters with years of experience and contributions as mothers, homemakers, breadwinners, and community activists. Members of the National American Woman Suffrage Association organized statewide Votes for Women campaigns. They used buttons, signs, and gimmicks like the ring parade spinner to promote their cause and tracked their progress with maps and stars representing their victories. The Western states were the first to accept women as voters. To pressure President Wilson to support a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote, suffragists from the National Women's Party became the first people to picket the White House. When they began in the winter of 1917, the public tolerated, even admired, the picketers for their dignity and tenacity. When America entered World War I, the picketing seemed unpatriotic and embarrassing to the government. The suffragists were arrested and jailed for obstructing traffic. Reports of abuse and force-feeding and the courage of the imprisoned women generated public sympathy, and the picketers were released. The freed prisoners were honored with silver pins in the shape of prison doors. All of the picketers received silver banner brooches. These pins belonged to Alice Paul, leader of the picketers, and Amelia Himes Walker. Voting rights expanded, contracted, and expanded again as Americans dealt with shifting issues of politics, race, class, and wealth. Each addition to the electorate brought a change to the balance of power and led to collisions between practical politics and America's democratic ideal of government by the people. While some established voters believed that extending the vote to more Americans would strengthen the nation, others questioned including people who might not share their concerns or who could threaten their control of the country's political, social, and economic structures. In the early 1800s, women were culturally and legally subordinated to men. While more men were gaining the right to vote, women were still barred from the ballot box. In 1848, a group led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton called a convention on women's rights. On this table, they drafted a Declaration of Sentiments. Based on the Declaration of Independence, it demanded reforms to women's legal status. The most daring was the right to vote. It took decades of fighting for rights to their children, property, money, education, and employment, and successfully leading a national reform movement before they convinced a majority of American men that women also had the right to vote. The table on which Elizabeth Cady Stanton drafted the Declaration of Sentiments became an icon for women suffragists and was displayed at national meetings. In 1919, as state legislatures voted on the ratification for the 19th Amendment, leaders of the National American Woman Suffrage Association brought the table to the Smithsonian Institute to claim their place in the official history of the nation. The table has become a three-dimensional evocation of the struggle, achievement, and pride of the early women's movement and ranks as one of the treasures of the Smithsonian. Owning property of a certain size or value was the earliest qualification for voters in the new United States. In some states, women and free African Americans were among those voters. This is a land grant to Nicholas Hilton. Nearly all white men could vote for the president in the 1856 election. Free African American men could only vote in 6 northern states, but women could not vote at all. These campaign ribbons are from 1856. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Americans of different races, sexes, ancestries, religions, educations, and levels of prosperity demanded the ballot and full participation in America's political life. They worked to convince their fellow citizens that justice and true democracy required the votes of all Americans. In the face of sometimes violent opposition, they rallied, lobbied, and marched their way to the voting booth. Along the way, they found allies and opponents in the government and in their communities. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, free suffrage was the goal of men who believed that they did not need to own property to have an interest in the fortunes of their country or to exercise sound judgment on its behalf. They agitated to change state constitutions and abolish property requirements for voting. This cane, bearing their slogan, was likely carried in parades. Some men in power shared their philosophy. Others found the growing power of the common man, the shifting American economy, and the need for new voters to support their own new political parties were compelling reasons to support free suffrage. World Wars I and II focused American attention on the gap between the nation's assertions of democracy and the discrimination faced by women, African Americans, and other minorities. Voting rights became civil rights. In 1917, suffragists compared President Woodrow Wilson to the German Kaiser and pointed out the hypocrisy of his pro-democracy rhetoric when American women could not vote. In 1965, after a demonstration in Alabama erupted in violence, African American residents planned a march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. The Reverend Hosea Williams, a leader of the march, had his overcoat torn when Alabama state troopers attacked the marchers. His wife Juanita wore down her shoes on the 54-mile walk. Millions of Americans were horrified by images of the peaceful marchers led by Reverend Williams and John Lewis being beaten by police while white onlookers cheered. From across the nation, volunteers came to join the march. Others sent letters and telegrams to Washington demanding reform. Almost 100 years after the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote, African Americans were still blocked from the polls in many states. In the South, poll taxes, literacy tests, complicated voter registration rules, intimidation, and even violence made it impossible for blacks to vote. Voting right demonstrations were viewed as a threat to the entrenched white power structure and culture of racial segregation. In 1962, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee began conducting voter education and registration drives in Mississippi using the slogan, "One man, one vote." 4 months after the public outcry over the brutality in Selma, President Lyndon Johnson used this pen to sign the Voting Rights Act on August 6, 1965. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 sent federal examiners to the South to enroll voters and supervise registration and voting in areas with a history of abuse. The act struck down restrictive state laws that created racial barriers to voting. In 1975, the act was amended to include 4 language minorities: American Indians, Asian Americans, Alaskan Natives, and Spanish heritage citizens. Americans are proud to be part of a nation of immigrants, but some were reluctant to share the ballot box with more recent arrivals. Worried that they might have to compete for political power, they questioned the loyalty, political philosophies, religions, and self-interest of each new group. Tying voting to citizenship, combined with stringent voter eligibility requirements, lessened the gains and electoral impact of the late 19th and early 20th century immigration groups. New waves of immigrants furthered concerns over identity politics based on race, ethnicity, and class long after individuals became American citizens. Since 1975, voting districts with significant populations of Native Americans, Native Alaskans, Asian Americans, and Latinos have been required to provide ballots and instructions in applicable languages. These signs are from San Francisco. Although women were eventually enfranchised in 1920, Chinese immigrants were still barred from citizenship and the vote until 1943. Their American-born children had been accepted as citizens and eligible voters since 1898. In 1919 and 1920, Get Out the Vote campaigns in Grand Rapids, Michigan aimed to register the state's newly enfranchised women, promote voting, and encourage immigrants to become naturalized citizens so that they too could vote. Drawing on the successes of the African American civil rights movement and federal legislation, Latino and Asian American community activists formed organizations to fight for civil, social, and voting rights. This photograph is of a 1950s California voter registration drive. Founded in 1947, the community service organization led voter registration drives in Los Angeles and throughout California. The second photograph is of a 1977 voter registration drive in San Francisco. In the 1970s, members of Chinese for Affirmative Action ran registration campaigns and demanded bilingual ballots for San Francisco voters. In 1976, Safeway grocery sacks used Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Italian, French, German, and English to encourage patrons to vote. This cartoon by Thomas Nast points out the hypocrisy of enfranchising naturalized immigrants and not the country's original inhabitants. In the 19th and 20th centuries, most Native Americans were classified as either members of sovereign nations or dependents under guardianship of the U.S. government. Neither were citizens and neither could vote. Even those who were U.S. citizens could not vote in all states. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924 made all Native Americans citizens, but many states still found ways to keep them from voting. Some Native Americans preferred their traditional cultures and tribal governments and had no interest in U.S. citizenship or ballots. Others desired to combine citizenship with tribal culture. In the 1960s and 70s, Indian empowerment movements began to encourage Native Americans to use voting as a way to help improve conditions and keep tribal autonomy. Though part of a matrilineal tribal society, Chickasaw women could not vote in Oklahoma in 1910. This handbill encouraged Chickasaw women and men to support women's suffrage. Voters' motivations are as varied as their circumstances and experiences. Some vote to support or change their laws and leaders. Others are motivated by a sense of duty. Many see their first vote as a rite of passage, the final mark of adulthood or American citizenship. Whatever their reasons, Americans who stand in line at polls make a personal decision to participate in hopes of bettering their lives and their country. When it was first established, the United States of America boasted more eligible voters than ever before, but it was still just a fraction of the new country's population. The nation's founders never envisioned the numbers, classes, sexes, and races of Americans that cast ballots each election day. They envisioned a world in which propertied men rose above self-interest and voted on behalf of the rest of the people. Many of those people, however, showed a stubborn desire to vote directly to choose their leaders and laws. The result has been reluctant adjustments, contentious struggles, and ongoing negotiations as groups tried to persuade lawmakers, the courts, and their fellow citizens to let them share the power of the polls. This is an automatic voting machine from 1898. By the 1890s, voting had moved from a public declaration to a secret ballot. This machine's gear mechanism and curtain were designed to ensure accuracy, security, and privacy. If you made it this far, I would really like to show my appreciation for you sticking with me throughout this very long video about American democracy and the history of voting. I picked up this postcard in the gift shop, and I would like to send it out to the first person who comments on this video and says, "Hey, I want that postcard." I will send you an email address where you can send me your mailing address, and I'll be happy to stick this out with the next day's mail. Thank you. I want to show you my appreciation. I'm so glad that you were here with me for this video. All right, everybody, that is going to wrap up our walkthrough of American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith here at the Smithsonian. I know this was a long video, but I hope you found it as interesting as I did. It's a lot to take in, seeing how this country's democratic system was built, challenged, and reshaped over time by people from all walks of life. There's something grounding about being in a space like this, surrounded by the actual words, objects, and stories of people who believed they could make a difference, whether through voting, organizing, speaking out, or simply showing up. It's a reminder that democracy has never been perfect or finished, but it's always been shaped by participation. Thank you so much for watching and spending time with me at this exhibit. If you enjoyed it, feel free to like the video or leave a comment, especially if there was something in the exhibit that stood out to you. I would really like to hear your opinions. And as always, I'll see you another day in another adventure. Bye, everybody.